When Madeline Cooper arrived back in her mother's quiet coastal neighborhood of Bridal Shore, she wasn't looking for conflict. Her return wasn't dramatic, nor was it fueled by crisis or personal failure. She came because her mother, Grace Cooper, had taken a bad fall a few weeks earlier and needed assistance while she recovered. The injury wasn't life-threatening, just a fractured hip, but at 72, Grace had little interest in relying on strangers. Madeline didn't hesitate to offer her help, putting her consulting work on pause and leaving Austin behind to stay in her childhood home, at least for a few months. The plan was simple. Be there to cook, drive, handle the shopping and appointments, and make sure her mother didn't push herself too hard. It was supposed to be a peaceful chapter, quiet, manageable, and useful. Madeline had no idea just how quickly that expectation would collapse, or how something as mundane as neighborhood politics would ignite a confrontation that would spiral into something darker, stranger, and more dangerous than she thought possible. The house sat on a hill, built in the 1950s with a slightly slanted roof, broad windows that caught the morning sun, and a garden full of unruly roses and fading magnolias. It had always been an outlier among the newer developments that cropped up in the past decade, especially since the construction boom pulled in sleek, symmetrical townhouses with matching stone facades and coordinated driveways. But Grace never updated or compromised. She didn't paint her brick white or swap out her windows for vinyl or landscape the lawn to match the new design guidelines. She never joined the local neighborhood board when it was established 7 years ago, and she didn't attend their events, vote in their meetings, or even read their glossy newsletters. She didn't need to. Her property was grandfathered in under old zoning, and the Cooper house existed like a quiet monument to another time, a time before property values dictated personality and uniformity was more important than dignity. Madeline had always admired her mother's quiet defiance, the way she carried herself with a calm self-assurance that never bordered on arrogance. Grace wasn't sentimental, but she was deliberate. She remembered dates, names, and laws, and she rarely raised her voice because she rarely needed to. It wasn't that people feared her. They simply didn't challenge her, and that was its own kind of power. But returning now, with her mother slowed by injury and the neighborhood crawling with new faces and unspoken rules, Madeline immediately sensed the shift in energy. It wasn't hostile at first. It was more like a lingering watchfulness, a quiet, assessing stare from behind drawn curtains or politely strained smiles from women walking golden retrievers in identical pastel windbreakers. The neighborhood had changed. It had been absorbed into something newer, shinier, and, as Madeline would soon learn, far more aggressive. The first time she saw Karen, she didn't know who she was. It was the second morning after Madeline moved in, and she had wheeled her mother down the long concrete ramp someone from church had built a few years back. Grace walked slowly now, with a sturdy aluminum walker that clicked with every step, and insisted on taking morning air at the bottom of the driveway before breakfast. The air was thick with ocean salt and quiet except for the occasional bird call and the low hum of sprinklers in the distance. Karen approached with the confidence of someone who believed the world should part for her. She was in her late 50s, wearing a sky-blue blouse stretched across her chest and a pair of linen capris. Her posture was rigid, her chin slightly lifted, as if measuring every inch of the Cooper property with her eyes alone. She didn't greet them immediately. Instead, she stopped a few feet away on the sidewalk, looked at Grace, then at the walker, then at the garden, and only then forced a sharp, flat smile. "Good morning," she said, not as a gesture of politeness but as a formality, like checking a box. Grace simply nodded, not offering more than that. Karen's eyes narrowed slightly at the lack of response. Then she did something that caught Madeline completely off guard. She stepped forward without asking, hooked her fingers around the handle of the walker, and jerked it away from Grace with a grunt of effort, like she was dragging a broken suitcase off. An airport belt. "What are you doing?" Madeline snapped, stepping between them instinctively. Karen didn't look at her. She lifted the walker and swung it toward the street, letting it crash down on the curb as if it were trash waiting for collection. "This isn't supposed to be here," she said coldly. "It's an obstruction." Grace hadn't moved. She stood rooted to the spot, both hands still raised slightly from where the walker had been taken from her. Madeline's pulse surged. "That's my mother's mobility aid," she said sharply. "She needs it to walk." Karen finally turned to face her. "Then she can use it on her property. Not on public space. This is a shared sidewalk. It's in the handbook." Madeline was still processing the absurdity of the moment. Her mother, in pain and now physically unsupported, the walker dumped like garbage, and this stranger quoting a handbook as if it were federal law. She took a breath and helped Grace sit down on the low garden wall. Her mother said nothing. She didn't even look at Karen. Her face was still unreadable. But when Madeline bent to pick up the walker and wheel it back up the driveway, Grace's voice came out low and even, but unmistakably firm. "She doesn't know who I am." Karen smirked and turned away. "Everyone knows who you are. You're the woman with the overgrown lawn who refuses to keep up." "She doesn't know," Grace repeated, this time just loud enough for Madeline to hear. That moment, strange and quietly electric, stayed with Madeline long after Karen disappeared around the corner. There was something in her mother's tone, almost amused, almost predatory, that suggested this incident hadn't just been rude or careless. It had been noted, recorded, and filed somewhere in the meticulous mind of a woman who'd spent decades working in a system that most people barely understood. Madeline didn't yet know what that meant, or what her mother was planning, if anything. But she could tell by the way Grace's jaw tightened as she climbed the ramp again, the way she silently unfolded the newspaper and circled a few items with a red pen, that she wasn't simply recovering. She was waiting, watching, and quietly preparing for something. What began as a temporary stay for Madeline was already beginning to feel heavier, more loaded with consequence than she had expected. She wasn't just helping an injured parent navigate recovery. She had stepped into a game she didn't yet understand, with pieces that had been moving long before she arrived, and it was clear now that her mother wasn't just a player in this game. She might have been the one who set the board in the first place. 2 days after the confrontation with Karen, the first envelope arrived. It wasn't remarkable in appearance, just a standard white envelope with a printed label, tucked neatly between a stack of grocery store coupons and a real estate flyer. Madeline might have tossed it without reading, had her name not been listed beside her mother's in the recipient field. That alone gave her pause. Grace never added anyone to her property documentation without reason, and Madeline certainly wasn't registered as a co-owner. She opened it slowly, careful not to tear through any critical section. The letter inside was from a private management company she had never heard of, with a generic corporate name and a vaguely threatening tone. It cited a violation regarding structural inconsistency and frontage irregularities on the Cooper property and informed them that a $950 compliance fee had been issued as a result of non-alignment with current community standards. The wording was deliberately opaque, filled with phrases like pending assessment, remediation expectations, and escalation tier 1, none of which pointed to any actual offense. There were no photos attached, no inspection records, not even a name, just the signature of Bridal Shore Compliance Office, a seal, and a remittance address in another state. Madeline read the letter twice, then a third time aloud to Grace, whose expression remained completely unchanged. When Madeline finished, her mother simply folded her hands on her lap and said, "They're poking around." Madeline tried to press her for more, but Grace waved her off and asked for her coffee. That was how things went with her mother, always deliberately paced, always one step ahead, but never in a rush to explain. Madeline wasn't wired the same way. She was a planner, a processor, and her instinct was to act, not to wait. She went online, searched the name of the company, and found almost nothing. Their website was barely functional, with no contact info beyond a general inquiry form. She tried calling the phone number on the letter but was routed to a recording that promised a callback within 7 to 10 business days. It was clear that this wasn't a normal dispute. It was a test, or maybe a warning, and whoever had sent it didn't expect resistance. 3 days later came the second letter, thicker this time, with pages stapled together. This one claimed an unpaid maintenance alignment surcharge dating back 5 years and listed a balance due of 1/1400 years, including accumulated interest. It also mentioned escalation to lien consideration if the matter wasn't resolved by the following month. Madeline felt her stomach twist as she read through the dense, bureaucratic prose. She had managed properties before, dealt with zoning committees and permitting offices, and none of it had prepared her for the aggressive tone embedded in these letters. It wasn't just about money. It was a calculated intimidation campaign, weaponizing paperwork and ambiguity. She sat Grace down and asked, point blank, if she had ever signed any agreement with the current residential management structure. Grace, without looking up from her crossword puzzle, said, "No. I opted out in 2009, with a registered exemption before their articles of authority were even finalized." Madeline blinked. "Then how can they charge you now?" Grace finally looked up. "Because they think I won't fight it. Because most people don't. Because they're not targeting me, they're testing the waters. And you just arrived." The implication hung in the air. They thought Madeline was the weak link, the unfamiliar name, the younger relative who didn't know the ropes and could be pressured into payment or compliance. Madeline decided to do things by the book. She drafted a response, citing state laws regarding retroactive association enforcement, included copies of Grace's original exemption document, which, thankfully, her mother had filed meticulously, and sent it via certified mail to the address listed. She also contacted the county recorder's office just to verify that no lien had been filed yet. So far, they were clean. But what disturbed her most wasn't the fees or the legal gray zones. It was the feeling that someone had been watching. That impression was confirmed a few days later when she spotted a man in a reflective vest walking the property line with a tablet. When she called out to ask who he was, he claimed to be conducting a routine survey and refused to show ID. When Madeline pressed further, he left without another word. She reported the incident to the local sheriff's office, who took the information but told her there was nothing they could do unless the man returned or committed a trespassing violation. It was a dead end. Then the garbage incident happened. On a humid Friday morning, Madeline stepped outside to bring in the trash bins and found them overturned, the contents scattered across the driveway, soggy and punctured. The bags had clearly been ripped apart intentionally. At first, she assumed raccoons or a dog until she saw a piece of cardboard tucked under one of the bins. A flattened box from a bulk cleaning product with the words "Property Health Reminder" scribbled across it in thick black marker. Madeline brought it inside and showed it to Grace, who barely raised an eyebrow. "She's panicking," her mother said. "They're not used to resistance. They're ramping up because they're afraid you'll document something they can't deny." Later that evening, Madeline saw Karen again. She was standing across the street with a group of women, all of them dressed in nearly identical beige windbreakers, watching the Cooper house and whispering among themselves. When Madeline walked outside and made eye contact, they dispersed as if nothing had happened. The psychological tactics were juvenile, but they were effective. The sense of invasion, of being scrutinized and treated like an interloper, was growing. The next morning, they received a notice for a mandatory neighborhood compliance inspection, signed, of course, by the same management company. The inspection date was scheduled for a weekday, right in the middle of work hours, and included vague language about the need for interior and exterior access for environmental conformity assessment. Madeline nearly tore the paper in half from frustration. There was no legal authority for any such inspection without consent or a warrant, but the wording was just threatening enough to make most people comply. She posted a clear, private property, no trespassing sign by the front gate and left a written refusal of access taped to the door. The following day, a white van circled the house twice before speeding off. It didn't stop, didn't knock, just made its presence known. At this point, Madeline had reached her threshold. She wasn't paranoid, she wasn't emotional, but she had dealt with enough bureaucratic bullying in her career to recognize coordinated pressure when she saw it. She took a different approach. Using Grace's documentation, she filed an administrative complaint with the county tax board, citing undue harassment of a registered exempt property owner and listing dates, names, and addresses. The complaint didn't make any accusations. It simply requested clarification on the legal limits of private enforcement in residential zones, especially when applied to individuals who had formal exemptions on file. That was the first official step she took that would draw real attention. It wouldn't spark immediate action, but it would put the issue on record, and more importantly, it would put a spotlight on anyone who escalated further. That night, as the wind stirred the trees and the last of the sunset faded over the ocean, Madeline sat by the window, watching the street. Grace was already asleep. There was a deep calm to the neighborhood, a silence that only made the undercurrent of tension more pronounced. Madeline didn't speak, didn't move for a long while. She simply stared at the corner where Karen had last stood, and she made a quiet promise to herself. She didn't care how long it took or how many veiled threats they sent. She wouldn't be bullied. Not here. Not in her mother's home. And definitely not by a woman who thought intimidation was a substitute for law. Madeline woke up to the sound of something scraping against the side of the house. Not the loud, violent kind of scraping that would send a person bolting from their bed in panic, but a slower, more deliberate sound, like metal on wood. Purposeful, steady, unmistakably intentional. She got up quietly, not wanting to wake Grace, and crossed the dark hallway in bare feet, the morning light just beginning to seep through the blinds. When she pulled the curtain aside and peered out the window, she caught a brief glimpse of someone in a khaki jacket walking away from the side gate, disappearing around the corner before she could make out any details. She waited, watched, counted to 30, then unlocked the door and stepped out barefoot onto the porch. The morning air was damp and sharp. Dew clung to the railing. She walked slowly along the side of the house, and when she reached the gate, she saw it. An orange sticker plastered across the wooden fence post. The kind of vinyl warning label used by utility companies or repossession agents. The text was bold and black. Non-compliant structure. Pending review. It was dated that same day, and beneath it, in small print, was a reference number and a citation code that meant absolutely nothing without context. No agency was listed, no phone number, no signature. Just the implication. You are not in compliance, and someone is watching. Madeline pulled it off with a sharp yank, the adhesive resisting with a quiet hiss, and crumpled it in her hand as she stood there, breathing in the tension that had now fully taken root in her body. This wasn't miscommunication anymore. It wasn't passive-aggressive pressure or misguided enforcement. This was targeted, coordinated. Someone had physically come onto the property, placed a false citation without authority, and left without knocking or presenting credentials. And yet, if she reported it, there would be no proof, no video, no witness, just her word against the vacuum of official denial. She walked back into the house, opened her laptop, and began documenting everything in a spreadsheet. Dates, times, notes on every interaction, copies of letters, photographs of the sticker, the trash incident, the surveyor with no ID. She didn't know where it would lead yet, but if things continued in this direction, she would need a complete and defensible record. Over the next few days, the tone of the neighborhood shifted again. People stopped waving when she passed them. Cars she didn't recognize began parking at the far end of the block and sitting idle for long stretches, engines off, windows up. Once, she saw a woman in a beige visor take pictures of the Cooper house from the corner, using her phone in full view. When Madeline stepped outside and called after her, the woman crossed the street and walked quickly in the other direction. Grace remained calm through it all, her only acknowledgement being a quiet, "They're escalating," as she sipped her tea one afternoon. Madeline wanted to believe it would stop, that the bureaucracy would stall, or someone higher up would intervene. But Grace knew better. These types of conflicts didn't fizzle out. They calcified. The more someone resisted, the more determined the other side became to make an example out of them. Then came the false inspection notice. Delivered by hand, shoved into their mailbox without postage or return address, it claimed that a visual assessment had determined the home posed a moderate environmental hazard and would be scheduled for further review. The language danced just shy of illegality. It wasn't an official condemnation notice, but it used enough municipal-sounding terminology to mimic one. Madeline took it directly to the county office herself, waited in line, and finally met with a clerk who confirmed what she suspected. The notice was fake. It hadn't come from any department, and no inspection had been requested. "You're not the first," the clerk said, her voice low, eyes darting to the hallway behind them. "It's happening more often lately, but nobody ever wants to go on the record." Madeline thanked her, scanned the clerk's nameplate just in case, and left the building feeling a cold burn creeping up her spine. She returned home to find Grace speaking with a man on the porch. He was dressed in a gray button-up shirt and jeans, holding a clipboard, his car idling behind him in the driveway. Madeline approached carefully, watching her mother's face for cues, but Grace looked perfectly at ease. The man turned when she reached the steps and introduced himself as Greg Nolan, a contractor for a local maintenance firm, working with neighborhood coordination. The vagueness of his title sent every alarm in Madeline's head ringing. He said they were doing assessments on properties for potential sidewalk replacement grants and wanted to measure the front easement. Grace allowed him to finish his pitch, then, in her calm, matter-of-fact tone, told him that the property was privately maintained and not subject to external repair authorizations. Greg insisted it would be harmless. "Just a formality," he said, but Grace remained motionless. "This isn't a shared zone," she replied. "The easement is embedded in the title transfer. You don't have jurisdiction." Greg paused, smiled, then tried again, this time more firmly. "We've been told this parcel was added to the cooperative scope last quarter. There's been some reclassification." Grace tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing. "By whom?" Greg hesitated. "The Oversight Board." That was all Madeline needed to hear. She stepped forward and said, "We'll need that in writing. Please provide the documentation that shows the parcel reclassification and the authorizing signatures. Until then, I suggest you leave the premises." Greg's smile faltered. He said he'd be back with papers. They never saw him again. By now, the strain was constant. The attacks had shifted from passive to procedural, exploiting every channel of ambiguity to surround Grace's home in a maze of doubt, threat, and confusion. Then, on a Monday afternoon, as Madeline was preparing dinner, she heard the doorbell ring, followed by the sound of heavy steps retreating. She opened the door and found a package on the mat. Unmarked, no return address. Inside was a thick folder containing copies of building code violations, color-printed maps, and photographs of their home taken from various angles. Each item was highlighted in yellow and annotated with handwritten comments. At the bottom of the pile was a sheet marked "Confidential, Pre-Action Assessment." It wasn't official. The logos were cropped, the fonts inconsistent. But someone had gone to great lengths to make it look real. It was a warning. Madeline brought it to Grace, who looked through the materials slowly, page by page, without speaking. When she reached the last page, she set the folder down and said, "This is coordinated. They're preparing to move through civil arbitration." Madeline didn't understand at first. For what? They have nothing. We filed everything. We've done everything right. Grace looked at her gently. That's not the point. They don't need to win. They just need to drain you. Time, money, energy, make it so exhausting that you give in before they have to justify anything. It was a tactic Grace had seen before, used in quiet battles between private tax coalitions and independent assessors. Draw the fight out, not to win legally, but to exhaust the opposition into compliance. It worked in corporate circles. Now it was being used in neighborhoods. Madeline didn't sleep much that night. She sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, sketching out next steps, reviewing county regulations again, looking for something, anything, that could put an end to the spiral. The fight had outgrown reason. It wasn't about policy anymore. It was about territory, dominance, control. Somewhere in the background of it all, Karen remained the figurehead, the smiling face of civility turned weapon. But Madeline knew now that Karen wasn't working alone. There was a machinery behind her, hidden in plain sight, quietly grinding down resistance one household at a time. And it had decided that the Cooper house was next. But they had underestimated something critical: Grace's experience and Madeline's endurance. They were done waiting. Now they were preparing to fight. Madeline had never seen the inside of the county assessor's office until that morning, and she hadn't intended to go inside when she first parked. She had come to deliver documents, to drop off a certified packet that would reinforce the complaint she'd filed weeks earlier and to avoid further confrontation. But something about the quiet precision of the place, the carefully organized lobby, the slow-moving clerks, the calm murmur of transactional authority, made her pause. She watched a man in a construction vest hand off a sealed envelope. A woman with a binder tucked under her arm nod politely as she passed through the metal detector, and it struck her that this, here, was the real heart of the system. Not the posturing of residents or the veiled threats of committee letters, but the actual ledger of jurisdiction, the skeletal architecture behind every piece of land, fee, and boundary. Grace had always operated in these circles, not with bravado or bluff, but through procedure, paperwork, and the slow, crushing weight of law. Madeline realized if she wanted to fully understand the fight they were in, this was where she had to begin looking. The woman at the front desk wore tortoiseshell glasses and a plain name tag, and she spoke with the careful rhythm of someone who had repeated the same script 1,000 times. Madeline explained that she was seeking any current activity regarding reassessment of parcels in Bridal Shore and inquired, not as a resident, but as a registered agent on behalf of Grace Cooper, verified by power of attorney. The woman took the folder without question, but then hesitated when she saw the address. She didn't say anything immediately, just typed a few keys, scanned the screen, then glanced up, her voice softening slightly as she asked Madeline to wait a moment while she retrieved a supervisor. That change in tone, that reflexive discretion, told Madeline everything. Something was off. When the supervisor arrived, an older man with a gray mustache and a courteous but distant demeanor, he confirmed that there had indeed been multiple requests filed regarding the Cooper parcel in the past 30 days, far more than average, and all originating from the same private compliance firm attached to the residential board. But then he added something else. Among those requests was a proposal for retroactive tax penalty evaluation, citing underdeclared improvements on the Cooper property. Madeline blinked, struggling to process it. Improvements? There hadn't been any. The house hadn't changed in over a decade. She asked for details. The man tapped a few more keys, then turned the monitor slightly. On the screen were 3 photos, blurry but distinct, of their backyard, their shed, and the side retaining wall, all circled in red with notes attached. unauthorized outbuilding, structural addition, non-standard retaining expansion. It was fiction, but it had been filed as fact. And now it sat in the system, under review, capable of triggering thousands of dollars in penalties entirely based on fabricated claims. Madeline's voice tightened as she asked whether any of those claims had been verified in person. The man said no. The reviews were procedural, driven by photographic submission, and unless disputed directly, they were often processed without inspection. That was the loophole. The board knew what they were doing. They were using the speed and volume of digital bureaucracy to initiate punishment faster than people could respond. Madeline thanked the man, asked for printouts, and left with a fire behind her ribs. She didn't drive home immediately. Instead, she pulled into a library parking lot 2 miles away, took out her notebook, and wrote down everything. If this was the midpoint of the game, then this was where strategy had to change. She called a friend, someone she'd once worked with during a logistics contract in San Antonio. He didn't live in the county, but he had dealt with parallel structures before. Madeline laid out the situation as neutrally as she could, asked what he'd do. He was quiet for a moment, then told her plainly, "It's a resource trap. They're baiting you into small fires. You have to widen the scope. Go upstream, not downstream." She hung up with a clearer picture than before. Fighting every piece of mail, every false report, every bogus fine would be endless. But cutting off the source, the legitimacy of the board's jurisdiction, would end it all. Back home, Grace listened to the full account without interruption. When Madeline finished, her mother rose from the kitchen table, opened the locked drawer beneath her filing cabinet, and withdrew an envelope marked "For Audit Only." Inside were documents dated nearly 8 years prior, signed and notarized. A legal record of her exemption not only from the association but from its designated successor entities, a clause that Grace had negotiated with a former municipal liaison when the original transition of governance occurred. It had been granted quietly, buried in amendment language, and deliberately not publicized. Most people would never have found it, much less known how to request it. Grace hadn't spoken of it before because she hadn't needed to. But now, with violations mounting and penalties looming, it was time to use it. Madeline scanned the documents, cross-referenced the articles, and realized that Grace's exemption, still legally binding, had not been revoked and couldn't be without formal consent, which she had never given. That changed everything. The board was operating under false assumptions. Their actions against the Cooper property weren't just aggressive, they were jurisdictionally void. Grace's land was technically outside their scope. Every letter, every attempt at enforcement, every threat of penalty. They had no legal ground to stand on. And that meant Madeline could not only push back but expose the board for what they had become, an overreaching private entity attempting to enforce control beyond its legal reach. The next morning, Madeline submitted a formal declaration of exemption to the county's Property Review Committee, along with a request for investigative oversight into the activities of the Bridal Shore Board. She didn't shout. She didn't issue threats. She filed paper. She submitted forms. She used the system the way it was designed, the way Grace had always taught her to. Quiet, precise, unrelenting. And though it might take weeks for the wheels to turn, she knew this was the beginning of a shift. 3 days later, the phone rang during dinner. Grace answered, her expression neutral as always, but her tone slightly different. After she hung up, she looked at Madeline and said, "They're being reviewed." That was all. No celebration, no grand declaration. Just a confirmation that, at long last, someone above the noise had taken notice. Outside, the street remained quiet. The same cars were parked in the same driveways. The same porch lights blinked on at sunset. Nothing looked different. But inside the Cooper house, the energy had changed. The fear had receded. The terms had shifted. And now, finally, Madeline and Grace weren't playing defense anymore. The change came without warning. It was a Wednesday morning when Madeline stepped outside to find the street unusually quiet, as if something had pressed pause on the neighborhood's normal rhythm. The usual procession of dog walkers was absent. No cars passed, no casual greetings were exchanged across fences, and even the sprinklers that normally whirred like clockwork across the manicured lawns remained still. Something about the silence felt engineered, not natural, as though it had been agreed upon behind closed doors that this day would be different. It wasn't paranoia, it was pattern recognition, the kind you develop not from books or speculation, but from weeks of pressure applied with increasing precision. When Madeline reached the curb to bring in the bins, she saw it. At first, she thought it was just the reflection of sunlight, a trick of the light against metal. But no, it was real. Nailed into the soil just outside the edge of their property was a small sign, professionally printed, the kind used by service companies or surveyors. Except this one read, Preliminary Notice of External Reclassification, pending reallocation to community parcel scope. There was no contact name, no agency listed, no municipal seal, but the phrasing was deliberate. It mimicked the tone of legal process while stopping just short of actual enforcement. And that was the point. It was meant to create uncertainty, to imply that their land, their home, their autonomy, was up for negotiation. Madeline ripped the sign out of the ground and carried it inside, not out of rage but out of calculation. Grace was in the dining room, sipping coffee and circling articles in the newspaper. She looked up as Madeline entered, took in the sign without surprise, and said, "They've switched from warning to restructuring. That was fast." Madeline laid the sign on the table and sat down slowly. "They're trying to rewrite the map before anyone can check the ledger," she said, her voice low and even. Grace nodded. "Because now they know someone's watching, and they're trying to rewrite their jurisdiction before they're held accountable for overstepping it." Madeline had already anticipated this, but the speed of it was startling. They were now in a race, not of ideas or principles, but of administrative maneuvering, and if the board moved faster than the county oversight, the burden of proof could shift again. That was the danger. The system wasn't designed for integrity. It was designed for whoever got their paperwork filed first. By the end of the week, 3 more signs appeared. One on the far side of their backyard near the stormwater runoff basin, another posted to the telephone pole that bordered their side fence, and the third tucked between 2 hedges near the street, nearly hidden unless you knew to look for it. Each sign contained slight variations in language, suggesting multiple departments or agencies, but when cross-referenced, none of the agencies existed as listed. The acronyms were deliberately similar to actual state divisions, creating confusion that could only be resolved by calling the wrong number, reaching the wrong office, and being transferred in circles until the caller gave up. It was weaponized ambiguity, deployed like a fog across the property line. Then came the public accusation. Karen, emboldened by whatever conversations had taken place behind closed doors, called for a community forum. It wasn't officially sanctioned, but flyers were distributed throughout the neighborhood, some left in mailboxes, others handed out in person by a small crew of residents who moved like a volunteer task force. The meeting was held on a Saturday afternoon in the central green space at the heart of Bridal Shore, a circular patch of grass with a half-dozen benches, a gazebo, and a few low shrubs, designed more for aesthetics than function. Madeline didn't plan to attend, but when a neighbor knocked on their door and handed them an invitation under the pretense of being courteous, she knew they couldn't afford to be absent. They arrived early, Grace moving slowly with her walker, Madeline walking beside her like a shield. The gathering was already forming, a semicircle of chairs occupied by familiar faces, some openly hostile, others neutral. Karen stood near the gazebo, dressed in her usual pastel cardigan and clutching a thick folder to her chest like a badge of authority. She smiled when she saw Grace, but it was the tight, cold smile of someone who had already written the ending of a story and was now merely waiting for the audience to catch up. The meeting opened with polite formalities, mentions of community concerns, references to shared standards and safety procedures, but within minutes the tone shifted. Karen produced a map, enlarged and laminated, showing a revised outline of the neighborhood. In this version, the Cooper parcel was no longer marked as private or exempt but labeled as in review for compliance reintegration. Murmurs spread through the small crowd. Then Karen launched into her argument, citing unspecified complaints, referencing long-standing issues of nonconformity, and warning of liability risks posed by unregistered structures on the Cooper property. She never once used the word fraud, but she didn't have to. The implication hung heavy in every phrase. When Karen paused for questions, Madeline stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't attack. She simply asked, "What legal authority was used to modify this map?" Karen hesitated, only for a second, but it was enough. She replied with a vague reference to the Oversight Board's internal advisory team. Madeline followed up. "Can you provide their names, their authorizations, any record of a vote or motion passed to enact reclassification?" Karen bristled. "This isn't a courtroom," she said sharply. "It's a community discussion." Madeline smiled, just barely. "Then stop pretending it's a courtroom when you're accusing people of violating laws that don't exist." The silence that followed was brittle. Someone shifted in their seat. A chair creaked. The mood had changed. The next day, their mailbox was vandalized. Bent sideways, flags snapped, a nail sticking out from the post at an unnatural angle. No note, no witnesses. Just damage. Madeline called the sheriff's office and filed a report. The deputy who arrived was young and polite, but his eyes gave away what he wasn't saying. There was nothing they could really do. No cameras, no suspects, no evidence. Just another line in a growing file. And that was the tactic. Isolation through minor violations. Intimidation through plausible deniability. Grace remained unmoved. "Let them spend their energy on tactics," she said. "We'll spend ours on infrastructure." By week's end, Madeline submitted a petition to the county board requesting an emergency injunction against any attempted reclassification of their property pending formal audit. Simultaneously, she sent certified notices to the same compliance agency the board used, notifying them that any further physical interference would be treated as unlawful entry. But the board didn't stop. The following Monday, a drone hovered over the property for 17 minutes, moving in slow arcs, low enough to trigger the motion alarms Grace had installed years earlier but high enough to avoid legal limits. When Madeline ran outside, it retreated without a sound. That night, Madeline printed every document, screenshot, photo, and form, placed it into a single binder, and labeled it with one word: retaliation. This was no longer just a property dispute. It was strategic harassment, designed not to win, but to wear down. And they weren't playing by the rules. They were creating their own, twisting bureaucracy into a weapon and wielding it without accountability. But what they had failed to anticipate, what Karen in all her smug assurance had overlooked, was that Grace had spent the better part of her professional life writing those rules in the first place. And the more they twisted, the easier it became for her to unearth every inconsistency, every procedural gap, every violation of administrative ethics embedded in their campaign. They wanted escalation. They got it. But now it was coming from both sides, and the other side had just begun to respond. The package arrived just after sunrise, left quietly at the base of the front door. No knock, no doorbell, as if the person who placed it there wanted to ensure it was discovered by the right eyes and no one else. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, sealed with packing tape, but when Madeline opened it, she immediately understood the message. Inside was a printed packet of forms labeled Petition to Enforce Reclassification with Forfeiture Recommendation, stamped in a false but convincing imitation of county formatting. Attached were low-resolution aerial images of the Cooper property, each one labeled with accusations: non-permitted outbuilding, invasive perimeter deviation, unauthorized grading. The pages were marked Confidential, Preliminary Legal Action, and signed at the bottom with a name that didn't exist in the county clerk's database. It was a forgery, but it was a precise one, calculated not for official effect but to induce fear, confusion, hesitation. Grace examined it quietly, flipping through each page with the same calm intensity she used to read tax amendments or audit reports, her fingertip tapping occasionally on margins, as if counting the exact number of intentional falsehoods buried in bureaucratic language. When she reached the final page, she set the packet aside and said, without turning to Madeline, "This is their last move. They've used what they have. Now they're improvising." That same afternoon, a notice was delivered to the neighborhood board office, formally informing them that Grace Cooper, as current acting advisor to the County Tax Oversight Committee, had initiated a multi-property tax reassessment procedure targeting several parcels within the Bridal Shore subdivision due to anomalies in reported exemptions and property use declarations. It wasn't revenge, it was procedure. Every irregularity they had allowed, every backdated adjustment they'd pushed through on friendly terms, every temporary deferment they'd gifted to neighbors in exchange for cooperation, those decisions were now subject to financial review. The board, once smug and untouchable, would now have to account for each line they thought no one would ever question. And Madeline, working with Grace from the living room table turned command center, had provided the cross-reference data, property line scans, and procedural support to make the review airtight. The response was immediate and messy. Within 48 hours, 5 residents withdrew their informal support from the board and submitted letters distancing themselves from Karen's campaign. 2 others requested their prior complaints against the Cooper household be stricken from record. But Karen did not flinch. If anything, she became bolder, knocking on doors personally, pressing residents to rally behind a new motion, to have Grace declared unfit to represent herself in matters of community management, citing age, unbalanced behavior, and unprovoked antagonism. It was laughable on paper but dangerously persuasive when whispered through gossip chains and next-door chat groups. The final confrontation began not in a courtroom or town hall, but once again on the Cooper property. It was dusk. The sun dipped behind the rooftops and cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalk and weathered front steps. Madeline had just returned from a meeting with the county liaison when she noticed something off. Their mailbox, freshly replaced after the last vandalism, had been forced open. Not destroyed, not ripped out of the ground, but methodically pried, tools had been used, and not clumsily. Inside were printed screenshots, not of threats, but of their own communications. Emails Madeline had sent to auditors, time-stamped documents she had uploaded through secure channels, now returned to her like trophies. Someone had accessed systems they shouldn't have. This wasn't just harassment now, it was infiltration. Madeline didn't panic. She scanned every page for breach points, traced IP logs that night, and filed a report with the county's cybersecurity unit. She sent an encrypted memo to the same clerk who had first helped her weeks ago. No hysteria. No outrage. Just quiet precision, the kind that doesn't flinch even when the air gets thin and cold with implication. Then Karen made her mistake. In a hasty show of strength, she ordered a crew, contracted through an affiliated landscape firm, to begin trenching the land behind the Cooper fence line. The rationale was fabricated. Runoff compliance, soil correction, neighborhood drainage stabilization. But the trenching encroached by 4 feet into Cooper property. Madeline caught them mid-task. She didn't yell. She took photos. She asked for permits. When the foreman couldn't produce any, she called the sheriff. When the sheriff arrived, she handed over the documentation proving land boundary, and when Karen stormed onto the scene in her now familiar pale blazer and oversized sunglasses, barking about authority and maintenance rights, she was met with silence. Grace stepped outside and handed the deputy a laminated copy of the original subdivision agreement, highlighted, annotated, legally binding. This land, she said, was exempt before she moved here, and it still is. Karen tried to interrupt, but the deputy raised his hand and asked for her name, badge of employment, and any legal document showing jurisdiction. She had none. The trenching was halted. The crew left. The deputy filed an incident report on site. 3 days later, the county's formal investigation findings arrived in a sealed envelope. They confirmed that the board had knowingly initiated unauthorized enforcement actions beyond their legal boundary, had filed false adjustment notices with private oversight firms, and had violated at least 2 articles of regional governance regarding exempt parcels. Recommendations were attached for financial restitution and a review of the board's remaining authority. It wasn't a lawsuit, it wasn't jail time, but it was a hammer. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the kind that cracks the foundation quietly, irreversibly. Karen's influence collapsed within the week. Her most vocal allies publicly distanced themselves. She tried to convene an emergency meeting, but only 3 people showed up. Her flyers stopped appearing. Her name vanished from the front page of the community newsletter, and the silence that had once been coordinated and strategic now belonged to her alone. One evening, as Grace sat on the porch watching the sky darken over the rooftops, Madeline asked her whether she had expected all of it. Every turn, every escalation, every ploy. Grace sipped her tea, thought for a moment, then said, "I didn't expect it. I recognized it. Same game, just a smaller board." Madeline nodded. "And if they try again?" Grace didn't even blink. "Then I'll remind them who built the board in the first place." Inside, the air was calm. No papers strewn, no binders left open, no alarms set to buzz every few hours. Outside, the house looked the same. Modest, solid, a little worn around the edges. But now, everyone knew where the lines were, and who would defend them. In the weeks that followed the final incident, the neighborhood underwent a transformation that was both subtle and deeply felt. The hostility that had once hovered in the air like static began to dissipate, not with apologies or public declarations, but in the small, incremental silences that returned to Bridal Shore. The morning routines resumed their rhythm. Cars rolled quietly down the street. Dog walkers passed without staring. Mail was delivered without incident. And while no one came forward to say the words out loud, there was an unspoken acknowledgement in every cautious glance and every neighbor who nodded, just slightly when passing the Cooper property. The line had been drawn, and it had held. Karen's presence, once as constant as the rustle of sprinklers or the click of lawn shears, all but vanished. Her house sat with its curtains drawn and lights dimmed. Within a month, a real estate sign appeared on her lawn, posted not by a local agent, but by a regional firm that handled quiet exits for difficult clients. The sign stayed up longer than expected, and rumors spread that she was having trouble finding a buyer. The legal findings against the board, while not criminal, had been documented and added to the community's administrative record. Prospective owners, especially those who read the footnotes, were wary. Karen herself was seen only once more, loading boxes into the trunk of a dark SUV, alone, expressionless, wearing the same pastel jacket that had once symbolized control, but now looked strangely deflated, like a flag in windless air. Grace, for her part, did not gloat. She had no interest in rubbing salt into wounds or gathering praise. She resumed her walks, slower than before but steady, the wheels of her walker clicking against the pavement like a metronome that had outlasted the symphony. She planted a new row of late-blooming roses along the fence and spent more time on the porch, sometimes reading, sometimes simply watching the light change across the grass. People began to stop by, not to beg forgiveness or explain themselves, but to return to normalcy. A neighbor brought over a bag of lemons. Another left a note in the mailbox, unsigned, thanking Grace for holding the line. And though Grace never spoke about it, Madeline knew her mother felt the shift. She no longer sat with her back to the door. The house, once tense and coiled like a held breath, had exhaled. Madeline stayed longer than she'd planned. What had started as a brief pause to help with recovery had turned into something else entirely. An awakening, a reconnection, a confrontation not only with the neighborhood, but with herself. She hadn't just helped defend her mother's rights, she had stepped into the space between silence and injustice, and realized she was capable of standing her ground. The offer came quietly, from a contact in the county infrastructure office who'd followed the case and appreciated the precision with which she had handled the filings, the language, the strategy. It was a consulting position, temporary, part-time, but it gave her something she hadn't expected, a reason to stay. When she told Grace about the offer, her mother didn't smile or lecture or even comment. She simply reached over, took Madeline's hand, and squeezed it once. The final letter arrived on a Thursday. It was from the county's Governance Review Board, formally closing the investigation into Bridal Shore's enforcement practices. The board was to be restructured, its oversight authority reduced to a consultative role pending further election. Several procedural adjustments were ordered, and the review confirmed Grace Cooper's exemption as irrevocable and retroactively valid. The letter was brief, clinical, and utterly final. No appeals, no conditions. Madeline read it aloud in the kitchen, and when she finished, Grace folded the page carefully, slipped it into a file marked Resolved, and said, "Then that's that." Later that evening, as the sun slipped behind the coastal rooftops and the ocean, breeze cooled the edge of the air. Grace and Madeline sat outside with glasses of sweet tea and the quiet confidence of people who had not only survived something ugly, but reshaped its outcome. The garden lights flicked on in sequence, casting a soft glow over the stone path and the low hedges. Somewhere in the distance, wind chimes rang. Not sharp or clanging, but soft, steady, like breath through glass. Madeline leaned back in her chair and asked, almost absently, "Do you think she ever understood who you were?" Grace didn't look away from the horizon. "No," she said. "That was never the problem. The problem was that she thought it didn't matter." They sat in silence after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that needed to be said had already been done. Through action, through law, through persistence. No screaming, no spectacle. Just truth, applied with patience until it could no longer be denied. The next morning, Madeline walked down to the edge of the property, where the trench had once been dug and filled again, the grass starting to grow back over the disturbed soil. She ran her fingers across the top of the old boundary post, now standing firm and clean. There was no sign, no sticker, no stake claiming her mother's land. There was just morning light and the sound of a house that had earned its peace.